It was as if the whole room, no, the whole building was roaring in anger. The floors creaked, the walls bent, and the ceiling shook. I will kill you all. No, sis, stop it. Ugh. A crack ran through the ceiling above Faberge's and Mr. Forrest's head. Bits of wood and plaster started to rain down. Max, the amulet, hurry! I tried them all, none of them work. He raised his voice as loud as he could to be heard over the shrieking wind. That one! The one Shannon wore when she was pregnant with Grace. The amulet from when Grace was born. Of course. She still wore it when everything was still normal. And all she wanted was a happy and uneventful childbirth. What else had the power to banish this spirit whose soul was now hell-bent on revenge? As I reached for the fallen amulet, the wooden floor beneath me heaved up like a living thing. The amulet was thrown to the other side of the room. I stood up and ran over, but before I got there, Grace's hair coiled around my neck, lifted me up, and left me dangling in midair. Frantically, I tried to slip my fingers in between my neck and the hair that was squeezing the life out of me. Unable to breathe, I couldn't even call out for help. Stop, Shannon. If you care at all about Grace's happiness, you have to stop right now. Grace? For a moment, the pressure on my neck relented. I managed to get my fingers underneath the coil of hair, pulling it open enough so that I could slip it, inch by painful inch, over my chin, then my nose. Suddenly, I was crashing to the ground. Without wasting a second, I grabbed for the amulet, and in almost that precise instant, the blue-white flame around Grace's body shot in my direction. I squeezed my eyes shut and held the amulet out in front of me. I expected some kind of intense impact, but there was nothing. Cautiously, I opened up my eyes to find that the amulet had stopped the blue-white fire. Or maybe I should say that the flame stopped just short of the amulet, only to suddenly shrivel and disappear. Mustering all my courage, I stood. With the amulet held high, I began to hesitantly approach Grace. As I neared her, the flame began to dim and flicker, as if its energy was being sucked away. Grace, still hovering in the air, began to slowly sink lower and lower. Grace, my daughter. She's not just your daughter, Faber shouted bitterly as tears streamed down his face, and skipped a page. She's Henry's daughter too. Grace's body convulsed visibly when she heard her lover's name. Henry. I staggered even closer to her. Grace! Grace! Her blood-soaked chest was now level with my eyes. She was looking up at the ceiling, her eyes rolled back so I could only see their whites. I had no idea how I knew, but it was clear that the evil spirit, the spirit of Shannon, had somehow been drained of all her malice. Even so, I had no idea what to do now. I just stood there, clutching the amulet and staring at her, emotions boiling to a peak. Grace! I shouted the name that meant the most to me. Without thinking, I threw my arms around her floating body in a tight embrace. The moment our bodies touched, there was a blinding flash of light and a surge of power that nearly threw me backwards. But with both arms wrapped around her back, I clung to her with all my strength. The amulet heated up until it felt like it was searing into my palm, but I gritted my teeth and endured it. No! I couldn't tell whether the cry came from Grace or her mother. Grace! Give me back my Grace! I screamed out with all the power I could muster. Suddenly, gravity reclaimed its hold on Grace's body, and she landed on me heavily, knocking me on my back. Her body was slack, unmoving, and incredibly heavy. The dim blue-white flame that had been surrounding her hung in the air, no longer attached to her. For a brief moment, it seemed to assume a human shape, but in the next instant, it flickered and was gone. Shannon, sis. I looked over and saw Faberge blinking back tears, staring at the same now empty spot in space. Is she gone now? Faberge's head dropped to his chest as he nodded slowly. She's gone, I'm sure. She won't be back. It was suddenly so silent that the violent shaking and supernatural shrieking of the wind seemed like they must have been hallucinations. In fact, It was so quiet that we could hear the sound of the snow gently falling to the ground outside the window. Mr. Forrest, is he... He's all right. He just passed out. Faubers lifted Grace up off the floor, carried her to the bed and covered her with a blanket. Standing up shakily, I looked down at her face. How did this happen? And why did you... I've been searching for a long time for proof that somebody in the Forrest family was the murderer. At some point, I heard the rumor that a ghost was appearing at this inn every winter. I didn't exactly believe it, but I figured that even if it was just a rumor, the combination of fear and guilt might force a confession from him. But I can see now that it was very wrong of me to tell Grace what I knew. I think somehow there was a kind of synergistic reaction between Grace's shock and the residual spirit of her mother. It could be that Grace herself hated her uncle and her grandfather. In any case, what was at first nothing more than a simply lurking ghost was transformed into this demonic, vengeful spirit. Grace, will she remember what she did? If she did, she'd never be able to live with it. The violent murder of innocent people, the near murder of her own uncle. If she was watching it all, helplessly trapped in the prison of her own flesh. Faber shook his head. I don't know. If she did see it all, it'll be a shock that neither of us can imagine. I don't see how she'll be able to recover from something like that. Not alone, anyway. He looked me squarely in the eye, his face filled with sadness and empathy. You're the only one that can help her. Please, she needs you. I nodded, but secretly I didn't feel very confident. Still, looking down at her gaunt, tortured face, I swore that I would do everything within my power to help her heal. I went to squeeze her hand and noticed that I still had the childbirth amulet in my fist. I'd been grasping it so tightly that I had to force my stiffened fingers to open. I pressed the amulet into Grace's hands and wrapped them around it. I closed my eyes and realized what I was going to say to Grace when she woke up. Your mother, she still loves you. So, that's I think that's the main route of the Banshee chapter. It's kind of interesting. I like it because in the main route of the normal segment, the murder, yeah, I don't know, I keep calling it different things, but in that main section, we very briefly mention something about the Banshee, but we never actually go into it much. But I find it kind of neat that they actually pull it up more here. Not exactly Banshee so much as, maybe a cold evil spirit, but I kind of like to draw the line in there. I don't know, maybe it's just me. Anyway, we are a bit over time, but I'm thinking this isn't going to take too long to get this other bit done. Whoops, there we go. So let me get us to that point. Alright, so what if we decided to, instead of saying, oh yeah, well, we and Grace are in love, yeah, I love Grace. What if we in fact say, no, not really, I answered. I didn't really feel that we were at that point yet. But you like her, right? Faubers continued to probe. So, yes, I answered honestly, which I think if we do that, we get the ending we just got, or we could say not really, she's not my type. Embarrassed, I finally just lied to him. Alright. I must have read you wrong. I guess I shouldn't involve a stranger in this. I'll take care of her from here. Stranger? What was that supposed to mean? He's the stranger here. Which of course doesn't make much sense unless we've just gotten that ending we've gotten. You can go ahead and leave her if you want. I'll do what I can for her. Like what? He grinned and took out some kind of pendant. It looked like it had been crossed, yeah, basically same thing. And let's see, I had no intention of leaving, or I obediently left the room. Which, yeah, we obediently left the room. The second the door closed behind me, I was struck by an overwhelming desire to be by her side. Still, I couldn't just go back in there and say I was lying. I really love Grace. Besides, Faubers seemed to know what he was doing, sort of. I figured I could leave it to him. I went back to the Buchanan's room and peeked inside. Bobby and Abby had laid Mr. Buchanan on the bed and were working on her wounds. Both of them were covered in blood. It looked like a hospital in a war zone. I went in, but they were focused so much on Miss Buchanan that neither of them even noticed. Can you save her? Bobby just grimaced and shook his head. Maybe if there was a doctor. So without one, she was going to die. I glanced over at Mr. Forrest, standing slack-jawed in the corner of the room with his head in his hands, not even making a move to help. Mr. Forrest, what's going on here? I asked him somewhat accusingly. He peered up at me with an empty stare. You looked at Grace before and called her Shannon, didn't you? So is the story that Faberge told us true, then? About Grace's real mother being murdered? I don't know. I don't know anything. He shook his head fiercely, then covered his face with his hands and started to tremble. Just then, I was about to follow with more questions. I heard it. It was an angry and human-sounding shout, and then the entire building began to shake violently. Whoa, earthquake? Before I realized it, I was thrown to the floor by the powerful tremors. It was as if the whole building was screaming in pain and outrage. The floors creaked, the walls bent, and bits of wood and plaster rained down from the ceiling. This was no ordinary earthquake. Grace, could she somehow be doing this? Still, holding desperately onto the floor, I crawled into the hallway. Grace! I stumbled down the hallway towards her room, swaying left and right like a drunk college student. As soon as I got to the door, it burst open, and Faberge came flying out. Max, this is bad. Grace. What happened to Grace? It was then that I noticed the thin trail of blood dripping down from Faberge's forehead. I tried to stop her, but it was no good. No one can stop her now. She's going to kill us all. He was panicked and almost incoherent. Faberge, you gotta calm down. Tell me what happened. The swaying stopped. With a growing sense of dread, I peeked into Grace's room through the open door. The window was shattered, and the curtains flapped madly like a wounded bird. Faberge saw where I was looking and nodded. Shannon still hasn't left Grace's body. She caught me off guard and attacked me. Then, she jumped out through the window. If it weren't for this amulet, I would have been killed. He pointed to the Buddhist amulet on the pendant hanging around his neck. She went outside? Yeah, but she'll be back soon. If you find someone unprepared, she's going to strike again. We need to all stay together. What the heck? Was Grace going to be possessed by this evil spirit forever? Wasn't there anything I could do? I ran off to get everyone together as quickly as possible. Everyone, come on out! You're in danger by yourself! Hurry! Thinking that they might have gone back to their rooms, I banged on doors and called out to them. When people reluctantly stepped out into the hallway, Faberge instructed them to gather in the lounge. Filled with fear and apprehension, they meekly followed Faberge's confident, booming voice. We decided it was too dangerous to move the Buchanans, so we left them where they were. I didn't bother to mention the fact that it didn't make much of a difference even if they were attacked. Without a doctor, neither of them was going to live much longer anyway. There were 9 of us gathered in the lounge, me, Mr. and Mrs. Forrest, Bobby, Abby, the 3 girls, Faberge, and I. Once we were all seated, one of the 3 girls, a clearly upset Debbie, asked Faberge a question. Look, what exactly is going on here anyway? Faberge and I glanced at each other. Would they believe us if we told them about Grace's birth and the story of an evil spirit? It looked like Faberge was thinking the same thing. I can't tell you exactly what's going on, because I'm not sure myself. What I can tell you is that one of us has been slashed to death by something, and 2 others are seriously wounded. And I'm certain that something is close by, waiting for an opportunity to attack again. I heard several people gasping and swallowing heavily. The girls covered their mouths, looking like they were about to cry. Bobby fixed Mr. Forrest with an angry glare. Do you know something about this, Mr. Forrest? Was it Grace that did it? I couldn't keep my mouth shut any longer. It was the evil spirit of Grace's mother. Grace is innocent. Evil spirit? Bobby narrowed his eyes at me, as if he thought I might have lost my mind. Evil spirit, ha! There's no such thing. Right after he said it, it looked as if Bobby was standing up angrily, since he shot out of his seat. But, to my amazement, he continued to rise into the air. Then, I noticed some kind of white blonde tendril around his throat. I looked up, followed it to where it led. Horrified, I stared at the form of Grace somehow clinging to the ceiling. Her long blonde hair was wrapped around Bobby's throat as he dangled in midair. He was kicking his legs wildly, trying desperately to pull the noose of hair off his neck. Screams and cries filled the room. Grace, stop! My voice was drowned out by an otherworldly scream, one infused with overwhelming sadness and anger. I will kill you. Ah! Mr. Forrest let out a pathetic shriek as he ran towards the front entrance. The hair around Bobby's throat started to curl upwards. I thought she was letting him go, but suddenly, she bashed him against the ground with superhuman strength. Mr. Forrest made it to the inner door of the entrance. He looked like he was trying to run outside. I will not forgive. Grace's eyes shot towards the desperately fleeing Mr. Forrest. Suddenly, he came to a halt, his feet stopping dead, and his face rearranged itself into a mask of utter, heart-stopping terror. Tendrils of hair shot out from Grace's head, writhing through the air towards him like vengeful serpents. I heard the sound of the others fleeing to the farthest corners of the room, but like a man staying transfixed at a gruesome car accident, I couldn't tear my eyes away. Murderer! The tendril of hair began to lash his body savagely. In an instant, his back was shredded from his shoulders to his waist. Blood flew from it like angry raindrops. Stop! Next, the hair flashed towards his face. He threw up both arms for protection, but they were quickly shredded to the bone as he let out a blood-curdling scream. With each whip of the hair, blood flew across the room. It splashed on my legs, my face. I was frozen with fear, unable to move, a powerless witness to a ghastly execution. Why did you kill us? It was a mistake. I just went to deliver the payoff money. If you hadn't made a scene, it wouldn't have happened. It wasn't my fault. Mr. Forrest cried pleadingly, spit flying from his mouth. So you killed them? Faberge asked in a surprisingly calm voice. It wasn't my fault. For some reason, I was more shaken by the fact that he did it. The storm outside had died. Same thing. Ooh. I will not forgive. With that, Grace's body was engulfed in what looked like a blue-white flame. A thick rope of her hair shot out and reached towards Mr. Forrest's neck. As if entranced by it, he stood there unmoving, his eyes staring wide. Faberge reacted first. Taking the pendant off his neck, he hurled it at Grace. The instant it struck her, it flashed with a bright light. A roar came from Grace's mouth that sounded as if it was reverberating from the very depths of the earth. It looked like that cheap pendant actually worked. But when the collection of charms fell to the floor, the object of Grace's wrath was turned from Mr. Forrest to Faberge. Like a striking cobra, Grace's hair reached out and encircled his throat. Without the pendant to protect him, Faberge was helpless from her. Do not interfere. Sis! Sis? Even Grace, the spirit, seemed shocked for a moment. The spirit's anger turned to confusion. I looked back and forth between Faberge and the pendant on the floor. The pendant continued to glow faintly. Faberge continued to talk. And same thing for here. I will kill you all. All the windows shattered, and the freezing cold wind and snow came pouring in. Before my eyes, Grace's hair grew longer and longer, stretching out in all four directions like massive tentacles. It snagged Colleen, Bobby, and Abby while they were still stunned by the supernatural display. I ran to retrieve the pendant off the floor, but before I got there, Grace's hair coiled around my throat. Frantically, I tried to slip my fingers in between my neck and the hair that was squeezing the life out of me. Grace? For a moment, the pressure relented. I rolled on the floor and reached for the pendant. and at almost the precise instant I grabbed it, the blue-white flame around Grace's body shot my direction. And this is also very similar. Grace! I shouted the name that meant the most to me. It was as if saying her name freed me from all the restraints of common sense. Without thinking, I threw my arms around her floating body in a tight embrace. Shannon! I looked over and saw Faberge blinking back tears, staring at the same now empty spot in space. Is she gone now? Faberge's head dropped to his chest as he nodded slowly. She's gone, I'm sure. She won't be back. It was suddenly so silent that the violent shaking and the supernatural shrieking of the wind seemed like they must have been hallucinations. In fact, it was so quiet that we could hear the sound of the snow gently falling to the ground outside the window. Faberge lifted Grace up off the floor, carried her to a sofa, and covered her with his own shirt. Shakily standing up, I looked down at her face. How did this happen? Still looking down at her gaunt, tortured face, I swore that I would do everything within my power to help her heal. This conversation went exactly the same as before. I went to squeeze her hand and noticed I was still clutching the childbirth amulet. Then I closed my eyes. I didn't know if there was anything I could do, but I was going to stay by her side until the day her smile returned. So that's another ending. That's, I guess you could call it an alternate ending. I wouldn't call it a true ending and then the other one not being a true ending. I would call it an alternate ending because they're probably pretty darn similar, honestly. So that's the end of the Banshee chapter. Now, I'm actually kind of curious because I don't remember if there's any real difference if we screw up one of these things, one of these decisions along the way, because I don't think there's any, bad ending in this chapter. So hold on 1 second. So what happens if we don't run off to get everyone together as quickly as possible? I need to go outside and find Grace, I thought. I rushed outside of the room. Sticking my head out of the window, I looked around. Grace! I screamed her name. But the only reply was the swirling snow and the frenzied howling of the wind. I turned and started to run out, but was stopped by Faberge's urgent plea. Max, what are you going to do? I've got to find her. I've got to save Grace. Even though you don't like her? I was just lying. I felt my face turn red as I said it. Faberge was kind enough not to bring up what I had said earlier. Running out in the storm like a crazy man. How is that going to help her? She'll be back, believe me. Just wait until then. After a little thought, I realized he was right, so trying to suppress my feelings of helpfulness, I went with Faberge to gather the others. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that all of these other options basically just loop back into the main route. Or loop back into the route you're in, so to speak. So, with the exception of some of the very early ones in the route, where we are still kind of in the any chapter section, or shared route, as visual novels usually call that. But most of these just kind of loop back in after a short leave. So anyway, that was the occult chapter, or what I like to call the Banshee chapter. It's a very short chapter, only 2 endings. And let's see what we've got next. Ooh, next we've got most of the remaining chapters are going to be joke chapters, or one of them is kind of, I don't even know what to call it, so I'm not going to call it anything and just let you guys see it. But the next 2 endings, we'll either get 1 done per video, or we'll get 2 done in the next video. I'd say we maybe have 2 weeks left to finish this, just as a rough estimate. And it should be interesting. So yeah, we just finished with that. I hope you guys enjoyed it somewhat. I guess I'll give a quick rundown of my thoughts on it. I thought it was fairly good. They kind of did a few kind of cheap horror things, where like why did the phone ring and you heard Grace's voice? That didn't make any sense at all. At all, really. There's no reason why you should have heard that other than, ooh, spooky. Yeah. So that didn't really have a point. And then, what was the other one? There was another one. Oh yeah, and just kind of that Grace went and took a shower without noticing that, she was covered in blood. I'm not quite sure how that came about. That one does seem a little odd. But notwithstanding, I thought it was kind of cool. I liked that they took Mr. Forrest, who throughout most of these stories has been a good person, or has been kind of like he's never been anywhere near evil. The worst he got was in the spy chapter, where he's kind of sort of not a bad guy, but he's a little bit shameful maybe. And they made him into basically the bad guy in this one. Whereas Faberge, who was obviously originally the bad guy, was the good person in this one. And, interestingly enough, they actually used his fake journalism status as something for the story, which I thought was kind of cool. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed, and next time we'll come back for more Banshee's Last Cry. Bye!